Hi, I'm Liz Whiteacre, and we're going to talk about writing creatively for an audience and literary citizenship. This week in class, we're focusing on what it means to be a good literary citizen as we start to join our creative writing community. We'll be exploring plot through various techniques. This week, we'll focus on Freytag's pyramid and the hero's journey. We'll also take a look at Kurt Vonnegut's plotting method next week, and we will be exploring plot throughout the whole term in a variety of different genres and different forms. We'll also think today, as we start our discussion, about how plot functions in different genres. A literary citizen is someone who participates in a literary community. You're probably already in one of these groups, right? You've been a reader, you are a reader, you will be a reader, maybe by the end of the term if you don't identify that way so far. Writers, editors, publishers, super fans. So all the people who participate in the literary community help support each other. So a good literary citizen is someone who doesn't just hide in their house and read a book, but then they might follow up and talk about that book with someone else. They might write an Amazon review or a Goodreads review. Perhaps they tweet the author how much they really enjoyed it, if that person has a Twitter account, of course. You might think about how you are promoting and participating in different events like book clubs or readings. We have our reader series on campus, the Kellogg Reader Series. So you'll have an opportunity to participate with some authors who are going to be joining us in conversation and reading from their work all term. If you write something in this class that you really love, you can always submit your work to our literary magazine, Etchings Magazine, for publication. You can support your classmates who are published by the literary magazine. There are lots of different ways to get active, and active is the key word. To be a literary citizen means to be part of the community, part of the conversation, sharing with other people, and being engaged. And the more you're engaged with the world of writing and reading, and generally people, it can be really rewarding not only for us, but for all of those involved. We'll also be focusing on plot this week, thinking about the structure of fairy tales, starting with the story of Cinderella, the different cultural tales, interpretations of that story that you might choose to focus on in your activities in the Sky Pack. At its base, plot in a story, in an essay, in a movie, in a play, in a poem, in a music video, anything that has narrative to it. Plot, if you boil it down, we're talking about obstacles. What's happening? We have something that happens to someone or something, and they respond to it. A decision has to be made. Well, do I accept this? Do I not accept this? Do I take that path? Do I not take that path? And those decisions are going to have consequences. And hopefully, as then our beloved characters respond to those consequences that may lead to more obstacles, that may lead to more decisions, ultimately we're going to see some sort of growth. We're most familiar with plot in, say, short stories or novels, because often that's what people consume the most. But creative nonfiction essays, personal essays, memoir, we're taking the narrative of life, if you will, and thinking about what are the obstacles, decisions, consequences, and growth we need to share with our readers so that they understand why this time in our lives we're writing about is significant to us. So we'll let them know what happens, and then we also include that reflection to explain what the context of that is and what life lesson we're learning from it. We'll even see plot used in poems. There could be a narrative-based poem where it feels like a short story, very specific things happen, or it might be a poem that zeroes in and just focuses on one moment of decision. maybe one obstacle, one consequence, one moment of growth. So we'll have an opportunity to take a look at different examples throughout the next few weeks and think about how what we're putting on the page engages the reader to think about their lives, and as they cheer characters on, as they boo the villains we include, as they think, oh, how could one more bad thing happen to this person, right? They're on the edge of their seat waiting to find out, how do these people respond, and what's the payoff, what's the ultimate life lesson, how do those people change at the ends of our stories, our essays, our poems. In the Sky Pack, you'll learn a lot more about the hero's journey and also Freytag's pyramid, but I wanted to give you a heads up so you know what was coming. The hero's journey is a way to think about plot. So this is one strategy that writers will use often in novels to kind of categorize or think about the pacing and what happens. So if we start up here at the top with our hiker at the 12 o'clock in our circle, right, there's usually a call to adventure. Something happens that makes our character do something, move forward, make that very first decision. In the hero's journey, there's often a supernatural aid of some sort. So if we're thinking about our moment in Cinderella, it could be the fairy godmother, right? Calling to Cinderella, she says, okay, everybody's going off to the ball. Boy, I wish I could. And then the fairy godmother comes and says, I will give you what you need to be able to move forward. There's some sort of threshold that has a guardian. Think of that kind of the keeper at the gate. If we're thinking about Cinderella, that could be the stipulations placed upon her in order to be able to go to the ball. So at the beginning of the transformation, she's given the carriage, she's given the beautiful gown, but she's told you only have until the strike of 12 at midnight, and it's all going to go away. During this time of between the threshold and the transformation, there are helpers, right? There are obstacles, there are challenges to kind of leave the mission and veer off and maybe make an easier choice or do something else. There's often a mentor helping the person along. Right? The revelation, that is a moment perhaps of crisis, or that, oh, this is it. Right? I love the prince. This is the moment. This is often called the abyss. It might be a literal death and rebirth, depending on the story, but it might also be a metaphysical, spiritual death and rebirth that leads to transformation, that leads to some sort of atonement or coming to peace, that has a return, right? The character, our hero, gives back in some way, and then we're usually coming to the conclusion of that story. Again, this is applied often in novels. It's not used as frequently in short stories because this is a cycle that needs a little bit of time to take place. We can't specifically fit our story of Cinderella in this because it's just too short. But if you were interested in revisioning the story of Cinderella by the Brothers Grimm into a longer novel, you could use the hero's journey to inform the plot that you choose to develop for that. So in that way, it can be helpful for us as readers to help us see and understand a structure, and also as writers to use that structure as a path to help us make decisions about what we want to have happen in our work. Another way to look at plot is Freytag's pyramid. If you see in here, it's a totally different way to vision the structure of a story than our hero's journey. That's much more circular. Here we have, over here, I'm starting by the house, right? We have what's called exposition. You can think of that as backstory. This is the part that is setting the stage for what we need to know in order to join up with our characters, our narrator, and start the story. Every once in a while, oftentimes in Hollywood movies, the exposition is skipped and we just dive in what we call medias res. We just start with the explosion. We don't know what's happening, and we move on from there and figure things out as the characters figure things out. So these are not prescriptive. These are not rules that have to be followed meticulously. Authors, again, kind of take these concepts. Generally, these things work well for short stories, and then they customize them and make them fit. The inciting incident is the thing that happens, like that big explosion that kicks things off, right? It happens, and that narrator, that character, that speaker has to respond in some way and begins our path of, here we call it rising action. And if you look, it kind of looks like stairs, because a lot of times this part of the pyramid that swoops up towards the climax has more than one thing that happens. Maybe my inciting incident is I drop my keys and I can't find them. And then that leads to me leaving the house late, and that leads to me passing someone I normally wouldn't pass, and that leads to a chance meeting, that leads to an opportunity. So the rising action are all of those little things that happen that takes us to the climax. And the climax is that big moment of, it has to be dealt with. Right? The character realizes, like, this is the moment. It's do or die. It's now or never. I have to make this decision, and I know I will be a different person afterwards. And of course, we're all rooting for the right decision to be made. After that, we have falling action. Again, this might be very brief. It might be very long. And those are the little moments where we get to see the fallout from that climatic event or decision. And we're able to see how the narrator or characters are processing what's happened to them and the other decisions that are made in response to that. This can be the period of time where we're beginning to see that growth of character, and we're understanding how everything that's happened in the story so far is changing that person or people or place. At the end of the story, there's usually some sort of resolution. That's not always the case, right? We can all name at least 3 or 4 different cliffhangers that leave us on the edge of our seat, not sure what's happening with our characters. And then over here at the end, we have a denouement, and that's French for resolution. We're come to some sort of satisfying, all right. And the readers have something they can think about after the story, and they can mull it over and decide, well, what did I learn from this story? And what's the life lesson or moral or message that I can take with me? Let's apply Freytag's style to our Cinderella story. I made this as a little bit rudimentary, but if we start right here in terms of our exposition, when we think about the start of most Cinderella stories, that's the period of time where we're introduced to Cinderella, her father. We find out her mom died, and that her father has met another woman and is going to be marrying her. Right? Even in a lot of different retellings of the story, that is the background information we get about Cinderella. And then here we have an inciting incident. That's usually the stepfamily is moving in. Stepmom moves in with her daughters, and they start giving Cinderella a hard time, and her father is unaware of that treatment. In our rising action, those are all of those moments when Cinderella has it rough, when she's yelled at to go clean, when she finds out about the ball but she can't go and she has to help her sisters get ready, right? All of those different moments. In some versions, she's able to make a dress, but the stepmother still denies her access to that special privilege. Our climax is when Cinderella makes it to the ball and meets the prince, and right? It's life-changing for her. This is a world that is amazing. And then, oh, ding dong ding, right? The clock starts to strike 12, and we are not sure how things are going to turn out for her, right? Our falling action really kind of takes us from this high moment of 2 people falling in love to being separated and torn apart. The only thing the prince has is that slipper to try and find his true love. And so as we start to come down in the falling action, There are not a lot of positives. The prince is trying to find her. The step family is trying to hide her until we get down to that resolution or denouement when finally the prince finds her and they marry. We're at the conclusion of our story. So again, thinking about the hero's journey, Freytag's pyramid, these are just ways for us to figure out, for those of you who love science, right? And charts and graphs, right? This is your moment to play around with all of those expertise you bring into the class. How do we kind of quantify the way something is structured that is obviously successful? Cinderella has been around for hundreds of years. People keep returning to that same type of plot structure. This helps us start to see it visually. And if you take the Freytag's pyramid and kind of use it to shape out your own stories you're working on, sometimes you'll realize like, oh, what is my inciting incident? Or it's hard to tell what my climax is. That can help you tighten up your plot, your story, and be a tool on the revision end before you're sharing your work with other people. So plot in fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry. They are similar in a lot of ways. In fiction, just we took a look at Cinderella with Freytag's pyramid and the hero's journey. You're creating a series of events that your characters need to respond to. And in responding to them, there's some sort of character growth that teaches them a life lesson. I mean, those are usually the stories, if we think back and really take a hard look, those are the stories that we find very satisfying as readers. We're like, oh, I read that and I got this cool thing out of it. Bonus points if you cry or laugh out loud, right? In nonfiction, you're basing that on what's really happened. So as a nonfiction writer, when you're thinking about plot or narrative or the story you're trying to tell, you need to think about, well, this happened. How much of that is relevant to your readers and understanding? So you might choose to highlight some things. If I want to tell you about a car accident I was in, it might not be relevant for you to know that coincidentally my sister was doing this other thing at that time, right? So you're kind of picking and choosing, what does the reader need to know in order to understand what I want them to learn from my experience? What am I trying to pass on to them? And then you also think a little bit about what order does that make sense to go in. So sometimes in nonfiction we'll move linearly. It started day 1 and then day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. Other times we might start now and then take you back into the past and bring you back to now, or non-linearly. So depending on your goal as a nonfiction writer and what type of event you're talking about and how complicated it is, those might be factors that affect how you're presenting plot or narrative in your personal essay, your memoir, etc. And the last is poetry. A lot of people don't necessarily think about plot in terms of poetry because often poems are fairly short. So we don't necessarily think about being able to get through an entire pyramid or an entire circle of the hero's journey. And we'll look at a few other things as well. But as a poet myself who writes narrative poetry, I think that plot, or if you want to think of it as action, in poems is something that we need to pay attention to as writers. What's happening in the poem? Even if my speaker in my poem is sitting perfectly still and doesn't do anything, right? The poem's taking place entirely in my character or my speaker's mind. What kind of movement do I have? What kind of leap do I have between the images or the ideas that I'm presenting my readers? So they're still feeling some sense of movement, moving forward, some action, so they can make connections between the different images and ideas I'm presenting to them. If I'm not giving them like a mini story to be able to picture in their mind. So we still want to be aware of that. And we'll have an opportunity when we get to our units that focus specifically on short stories, personal essays, and poems for you to play around and try different styles. Looking ahead, what's coming up? This week, you are taking the collage that you posted to the welcome discussion and using those images to create your first story for the class. So all of those things need to be incorporated in some way. You can choose to write a totally made up fictionalized story. You will appear as one of the characters, but whatever you want to have happen with all of those pieces, you can. Or if you can work all of those images, those things into a true story about your life, right? You could choose to write nonfiction, write as a short personal essay. So whatever you want to do, cannot wait to see what you decide to share. Then next week, you're going to start writing your own fairy tale. So we'll be taking a little bit more time, again, in SkyPack and next week to think about plot and environment or setting and character. And next week, you will draft your own first fairy tale. So if you have any questions as you work this week or next, don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks.